I see a lot of people in Australian professional circles angsting over what is the perfect type of upzoning to do. And I would just say, just go for it. Just do broad but modest upzoning. Try and allow for more intensive development around transit. We'll come back to that point. But, don't let perfect be the enemy of good.
My name's Peter Tulip. I'm Chief Economist at the Centre for Independent Studies. The CIS has just released a new paper by Stuart Donovan titled Less Crowded Houses: The Success of New Zealand's Housing Policy Reforms and Implications for Australia. And Stuart's joining us now to discuss the paper, zooming in from Wellington. For those who don't know, Stuart is Senior Fellow with Motu Research, a think tank in New Zealand. He's done a pile of research in urban economics with a string of articles in international academic journals. Until recently, he lived in southeast Queensland and has just moved to Wellington. So he's excellently placed to describe New Zealand housing policy to an Australian audience.
So as Peter mentioned, I'm dialing in from Wellington. I just moved here after 10 years in Brisbane. I'm from New Zealand originally, so I sort of followed housing outcomes and policy developments in both countries quite closely. So what I'll try and give you a sense for today is what was involved in New Zealand's housing policy reforms, what the drivers of it were, what the effects of it have been, and what the implications might be for Australia. So I'll give you a national overview to begin with. Then I'll zoom in on a case study of Auckland, which is probably the most well-studied example of zoning reforms globally, and then finish with some lessons for, some ideas for what Australia might do next. So the main point I wanted to start with was just letting you know that after a decade of reforms, housing supply in New Zealand has surged. So it's the black line on this graph. The gold line is Australia. This is the number of building consents or permits per 1,000 residents per year. So you can see that this is from 2000 to 2024. You can see that for most of this period, the black line is below the gold line. So Australia has been, relatively speaking, building more housing than Australia. Starting in 2011, however, housing building consents in New Zealand began to grow, and they more or less kept growing for the best part of over a decade, and are now sitting ahead of Australia. I should mention that in this period, the population growth and income growth in both countries was fairly similar, quite comparable. So what you're looking at here is really, quite a strong difference in quite big differences in housing outcomes over time. Those sort of reforms in New Zealand that elicited that supply response, they followed a major shift in political rhetoric. So what this graph shows is the number of times that housing as a word was mentioned in the Minister of Finance's budget speech to Parliament. This is quite a nice thing to study because it's about the same length every year. And so I just counted the number of times that housing was mentioned in that speech every year. And you can see that around about 2012, there really was this big spike in political rhetoric. Housing became a much bigger topic at a national level. And that's fallen off a little bit, but it's sort of been sustained to this day. And to give you an example of this political rhetoric and the messaging on housing policy reforms in New Zealand, a lot of the communications from national central government has emphasized the distributional effects. So in response to a recent question on whether house prices in New Zealand should fall, for example, the current Minister of Housing and Urban Development, Christopher Bishop, said, yes, we want housing to be more affordable for New Zealanders. Average house prices in New Zealand are too high, and this is the kicker at the end. The flip side of house prices falling for those people who own homes is that they become more affordable for people who don't own homes. So you can see here the emphasis is on what an economist might call distributional effects, or winners and losers, effectively. Falling house prices are obviously bad for people who own homes, but they're very good for people who don't own homes. When you go below the national picture, that big rapid growth in housing supply in New Zealand that started around about 2011, 2012, it's been almost exclusively driven by councils that have upzoned. Upzoned is a sort of a shorthand for adopting policies to enable more supply. So on this graph, it's very busy, but I'll just talk you through it briefly. You have the orange line is building consents or permits per 1,000 residents per year for Canterbury. The blue line is for Auckland. The pink line or rose line is for Lower Hutt, and the black line is the rest of New Zealand. Auckland, Canterbury, and Lower Hutt, those are all examples of councils in New Zealand that upzoned. And what you see when you compare it to the black line is, for the rest of New Zealand, is that when you split those councils out, they're upzoned. You can see that obviously they went through a big spike. They rapidly increased their housing supply, but the consents in the rest of New Zealand remain broadly flat, muddled along at historical levels that are well below what we would want to achieve to keep up with population growth and income growth. So the message here really is that housing supply growth in New Zealand has been driven by those councils that upzoned. The construction sector workforce has grown strongly during this time. So this is a graph of construction sector workforce, number of people employed. It's approximately doubled. The number of people participating in architecture and building relating training has also grown quite strongly. Bit of a lag, but it's grown much more rapidly in recent years. So the point here is that the construction sector has expanded in response to this increase in housing supply, which is promising. So that's the national picture. Let's dive down now into Auckland and try and understand, I'll try and give you a sense of what happened there. So the background to Auckland's experience with upzoning is that in 2011, 7 separate councils were amalgamated to form Auckland Council. As part of the formation of Auckland Council, they had to develop a single set of planning policies for the whole region that became known as the Auckland Unitary Plan. The Auckland Unitary Plan came into full effect in 2016, and that led to a fairly broad but modest upzoning of approximately 3/4 of the urban area. So if you look at this map on the right, anywhere that is a shade of purple was upzoned, and areas that are orange were not upzoned. So you can see there's a lot more purple than orange. You can probably, if you know Auckland at all, you'll notice that there is quite a lot of orange in the central city areas though. And we can come back to that in the discussion at the end if you're interested. But the general point is that Auckland implemented a broad but modest upzoning. What I mean by modest is that most of the urban area was still subject to height limits of 3, 4, 5 stories. In terms of the effects on supply, when you compare upzoned areas in orange to non-upzoned areas in blue, and this is the number of building consents, you can see at the time of the upzoning, the orange line diverges significantly from the blue line. There was a lot of growth in building consents or dwelling permits in the upzoned areas. Another study looks at the effects on rents, and we see quite a clear departure in the rents that were observed in Auckland, which is the black line, compared to rents that you would have expected to see in the absence of upzoning. And you can see that divergence really happens pretty much around exactly the same time as the Unitary Plan started to come into effect. Of course, the gap was initially small, but it's grown over time. And, to put these effects in context, you're looking at the upzoning is estimated to have caused about a 5 to 10% increase in dwelling supply as a percentage of the current stock, and about a 30% reduction in rents compared to what you would have otherwise expected. So these are quite big effects. Another point here is that the supply of public housing also increased rapidly after upzoning. So this study looks at the supply of housing, the permits that were issued to government-controlled institutions. Again, the black line, which is what was observed, is much, much higher than the red line, which is what we would have expected to happen without upzoning. Worth mentioning here that before the Auckland Unitary Plan, social housing or public housing was about 3% of all permits. After upzoning, it increased to about 10%. So more than a 3-fold increase in the share of housing supply. When we look, and this is one of the sort of the new things in our paper, apart from summarizing the evidence for an Australian audience, we looked at the populations of older people, 65 years plus, and the populations of younger people, aged 20 to 34 years. And we analyzed, we basically split Auckland into quintiles of upzoning. So the left-hand side of this figure is locations that did not experience much upzoning. And the right-hand side, which is the 5th quintile, are locations that experience a lot of upzoning. When you look at the subpopulations for those two age brackets, you see that the growth in young population aged 20 to 34 is very heavily skewed towards the locations that were more heavily upzoned. So basically, young people moved into upzoned areas and vice versa for older people. In the paper, we talk about how this is likely to reflect a double dividend of better housing affordability, but also likely better access to amenities like jobs, parks, schools, friends and family, those sorts of things. So I think that the first takeaway for an Australian audience that I'd like to reflect on a little bit is that rapid progress is possible. So that, we're talking about a 10 to 15 years and sort of period of reforms in New Zealand, but the effects of the reforms were realized almost immediately and they've grown over time. So of course, the initial effect is smaller than the long run effect, but you still gain almost immediately. That surge in housing supply was sort of followed a shift in the political rhetoric. It's very hard for me to pinpoint what causality is here, but I am just observing that housing became a hot topic, and I see a similar shift, I think, in Australia. So that's encouraging in a way, even if it is a response to problems that we want to solve. That growth, it's from what we can tell, it's been primarily driven by councils that have upzoned, and it, was accompanied by quite a significant growth in the construction sector workforce. So in terms of Auckland, the evidence shows that broad but modest upzoning can quickly lead to more supply. You might well be asking what would happen if you went for a more ambitious upzoning, so not 3, 4, 5 stories, but more, 10, 11, 12. And I'm also asking that that question myself. So there's definitely more work to do. But even that modest upzoning that was quite broad led to a big increase in supply and lower prices. Supply of social housing surged, and that experience in Auckland, I think this is a really important point, is that just doing something and gaining the evidence of those effects has acted as a catalyst for further housing policy reforms. So there's sort of a learning by doing mechanism that kicks in, where you just do something and you upzone and you observe the effects and you keep going, to the extent that you need to. And I think that learning by doing is important. I see a lot of people in Australian professional circles angsting over what is the perfect type of upzoning to do. And I would just say, just go for it. Just do broad but modest upzoning. Try and allow for more intensive development around transit. We'll come back to that point. But don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Let's just start and we can work out further details as we go. I think the second point that I would reflect on for an Australian audience is that in New Zealand, there was a growing awareness that housing is a national issue. So until 2011, I think there was an assumption or implicit assumption at central government level that housing is something that local governments deal with, councils deal with that, and we don't need to worry about it. The problem here is that upzoning and building housing tends to have wide benefits for society that are realized by central government or state and federal government in Australia, but it has quite concentrated costs, at least in terms of the perceived negative effects of development. And that difference between benefits and costs does create quite significant political barriers that councils struggle to overcome. So in Auckland's case, even though its upzoning was a striking success, there were a lot of people at council level that were deeply resistant to upzoning the whole way through. And it took a lot of pressure. We talk about this more in the paper. Took a lot of pressure from central government, advocacy groups, professional organizations to get that upzoning over the line. So if you accept that housing is a national issue, and that federal and state governments have legitimate interests in housing outcomes, then I think that would warrant strong intervention where you see housing affordability declining, like we see in a lot of Australia. And I'm sure Peter knows a lot more about that. We can talk about it at the end. But that legitimate interest, I think it warrants significant upzoning around key locations that are of strategic interest to federal and state governments. So public transport, for example. State governments spend a lot of money running public transport services. Those services would be significantly more efficient if there was more housing enabled around transit stations. Of course, there's probably limits to the effectiveness of top-down reforms. That we have councils for a reason. They do serve their constituents, and different areas will have different preferences. So, you probably do want to allow, especially in the long run, for a combination of federal and state direction with local decision making. To get better local decisions, that we do want to, I think we want to reflect a bit more deeply on the incentives facing council. How can we change this political problem they face and make it incentivize them to enable housing? Basically, reward councils who build, who allow more housing and see more housing built. And that would be, that would be a nice complement to the sorts of top-down direction that you've seen in New Zealand. And it's something that the New Zealand government is currently working on, to offer financial incentives to councils. The third point, this is revealing maybe my bias a little bit as a researcher, but I do think evidence really matters. And that comes through from New Zealand's experience, that careful academic research of the effects of upzoning, or the effects of housing affordability, and representative public surveys on attitudes to housing, they do make a difference. I emphasize representative here because whenever you run a sort of public consultation process where people opt into commenting on, for example, individual development applications, you always get a very skewed subsample of the population who typically are much more opposed to housing development than the average person. It's not to diminish those people's views, it's just to say that they're not representative. And so there's real value in representative public surveys, and several councils in New Zealand, as part of their planning processes, have commissioned representative public surveys as a complement to their public consultation process, so they can understand, so that they can at least have some insights into the relative biases that are affecting their public consultation. So that's something that I think is worth reflecting on and trying to do. Institutions like the Productivity Commission and Equality Commission in New South Wales, and civil society groups like the Centre for Independent Studies, they also have a very clear role by sort of helping to interpret the evidence and facilitating these public conversations. Can be quite hard for council and or state or federal government employees to facilitate those conversations. It's not really their role. And so there's a real clear sort of gap and a need for those sorts of contributions. Final point here before I wrap up, and we can discuss this a bit more and take some questions, is that I want to emphasize the effects of housing policy reforms on supply and price in New Zealand. I think they're very robust. That's not to say that there's not valuable research that needs to be done on, for example, the distributional impacts of upzoning. So who wins and loses? Our report takes a very sort of preliminary step in that direction by showing that young people tend to move into upzoned areas. That might give you a hint of these distributional impacts, but we need more research. And in the long run, it will be interesting to do more sort of international comparisons of housing outcomes. From what I can observe, house prices in New Zealand have, the trajectory of house prices has changed significantly over the last 5 to 10 years, and it's a much more moderate path compared to Australia. Obviously, the COVID spike period and interest rate sort of fluctuations create a lot of noise, but the initial signs are promising. So would want to look at that with a little bit more detail. So thank you for this opportunity. I hope it was interesting. And Peter, I'm sure you can elaborate and embellish on a lot of this and or critique.
Thanks a lot, Stuart. That's great. Well, no, I can't critique it. There's very little that you said that I disagreed with. So I want to talk about some ideas that go a little bit beyond what you said in the paper, trying to be a little bit provocative. The first question that strikes me is, what do we learn from the New Zealand experience that we didn't already know? And my answer is not much. What's happened in New Zealand confirms and illustrates that illicit zoning would lead to large increases in supply and to improved affordability, which is what the existing research already predicted. So in a sense, it's confirming what we already knew. But It does away in a very clear, very simple way that is very easy to communicate to a wider audience. And so if there are skeptics out there who, for some reason, are not persuaded by the bookshelves of research on zoning effects, my sense is just a few of the graphs in Stuart's paper are likely to be persuasive. That said, the fact that the effects are so strong in New Zealand means that it's also ideal for looking at some secondary questions, like the effect on the age distribution, something I'll talk about later, effects on public housing, perhaps even estimates of neighbourhood character. So there's a lot of research that flows on.
I think that's right, Peter. One thing I should have emphasized is that New Zealand has historically, I sort of alluded to it, New Zealand has terrible housing outcomes in general, towards the worst in the OECD. And so what the relatively large effects that we see in Auckland, I would say that that's a reflection of those terrible outcomes, and that housing was very expensive and quite severely constrained. And so when you're thinking about transferability to the Australian context, places like Sydney spring to mind as being clearly, a situation, a very expensive housing market in Sydney. And that explains, that might explain why you get large effects. But the evidence I didn't mention around Lower Hutt, which is a suburban council in Wellington, upzoning in that location also led to a significant increase in supply and lower prices. It's very easy to say, I've met people who sort of say New Zealand's a unique environment where housing outcomes were so bad, we can't expect that to be replicated in places like Australia. And I'm not, I don't really buy that. I think when you look at Auckland and you compare it to Sydney, I feel like Sydney's housing market is similarly expensive. And when you compare Lower Hutt, there are many, many places in Australia that have a similar urban environment.
Next point, and this is something that I get asked sometimes. So Stuart's paper summarises a very large number of academic papers, and especially if you look through his footnotes, there are a whole lot of government reports and consultant reports, all essentially showing the same thing. And sometimes I'm asked, well, of all of this, if someone wants to read the research, what should they look at? And so question, Stuart, for you is, what are your favourites here? I'll give mine, and three that I would mention. So first of all, we had Ryan Greenaway-McGreevy and Peter Phillips showed that upzoning led to a huge increase in supply, so a 4% increase in the housing stock in Auckland and a doubling in the construction rates. And then secondly, Greenaway-McGreevy and So showed that led to large reductions in rent, 28% reduction for Auckland. And then what I sort of saw, that was all very strong, but then what I saw was almost the knockout blow was from Matt Maltman and Greenaway-McGreevy that showed that you got almost the same results in Lower Hutt. So they'd be my favourites of the studies. Apologies for not mentioning yours, Stuart. Do you have favourites?
Those, I mean, I'm a bit like this, right? I'd mention everything. There'd be two that I'd add though. I think the paper by Greenaway-McGreevy that uses what an economist calls a synthetic control to show an even bigger increase on effect on supply to the first paper there. So, the first paper there uses certain methods. This paper that I'm referring to uses completely different methods and arrives at an even larger effect. So I think that's a nice complement to that first paper. And the fifth paper, which has only recently come out, really complements the second paper on your list. So this is a paper that Greenaway-McGreevy published in January, and that shows a similar effect on house prices. So predicts a similar effect on house prices of around 30%. So that really corroborates the rent effect in that second paper on your list. So there's a lot of alignment in the findings of these studies, which is good.
Though not absolutely everyone agrees, these results have been criticised by Cameron Murray and Tim Helm. And I wanted to say something about this because it very often comes up in conversation that people will say, but aren't these results contested? And in particular, when I spoke at the New South Wales Parliament a few months ago, this was the reaction. I mentioned the results from New Zealand and the research, and the parliamentarians asked me, but aren't these results contested? And I think that view is seriously misleading in the way that you shouldn't describe the research on vaccination or on climate change as contested, nor should you describe the results on New Zealand housing. So, and Stuart, I think, is overly modest in this because his is one of the leading papers that deals with these criticisms, a paper he co-wrote with Matt Maltman, essentially finding those criticisms are without merit. Stuart says in his paper that he doesn't know any authoritative researcher who agrees with Murray and Helm or of anyone who disagrees with Maltman and Donovan. And that's my experience also. I mean, I've spoken to lots of people about these things, and the weight of evidence is very clear. One way to see that weight of evidence is a poll of New Zealand economists conducted by the New Zealand Economics Association, which almost all of them agreed that upzoning is going to boost supply. So what I've said there is largely an appeal to authority, but if you want to look at the direct evidence, you can see that construction in Auckland boomed relative to the non-upzoned areas. Stuart showed a chart of that, non-upzoned types, that it was all in the new housing that was allowed, that is townhouses and apartments, and not relative to detached housing. It boomed relative to past experience. In fact, it hit record levels. It boomed relative to other New Zealand cities. It also boomed relative to Australian cities. And on top of all of that, you had large reductions in rents and prices. And I just think, given the breadth of that evidence, it's implausible to dismiss all of that evidence. This strikes me as extremely compelling evidence, which of course is one reason we're talking about it. Did you want any thoughts on that, Stuart?
I think no, not a lot. I mean, I have a paper that will be published shortly that that I guess explains my views on these critiques of the evidence. So I would say these results and the effects of upzoning are contested by some. In that paper, I evaluate those critiques, and I just don't find them to have any merit. So that's not to say that any particular study is perfect, but I think what I do as a researcher is I try and step back and look at the body of evidence. And the point of the previous slide that you had up, Peter, where you line up the different studies that consider this question from different angles and using different methods, and all of those methods and all of those angles reveal large effects on supply. And any sort of reasonable comparison you can make reveals these effects. And so sure, they're contested, just like some people contest the effectiveness of sunscreen. But, I think we have to be honest about the weight of the evidence.
One of the things that was very new to me from Stuart's work was the effect on young people. And this is a copy of the slide Stuart showed earlier. And just to recap, because it's a bit complicated, on the horizontal axis, we've got 5 quintiles of different areas in Auckland. On the left, there's very little upzoning, that they're not allowing any more building. And on the right is the areas where a lot of townhouses and apartments were allowed. The coloured bars represent the response of different age groups. The blue bars are old people, people over 65. And you can see that the population of old people grew very strongly in the areas that didn't allow more building. Where the orange bars are young people aged 25 to 34 years. That, as a share of the population, shrunk in the areas that didn't allow building. But if you go over to the right, it boomed. People moved into the areas where they built more housing. And of course, you see this in Sydney, in the inner suburbs, where there's no building going on. I mean, over the weekend I was in Balmain, which is, for those who don't know, is a inner city area. Used to be working class, is now thoroughly gentrified. A lot of properties run for $3 or $4 million, and it's a sea of grey hair. That the areas of Sydney that are not allowing more housing are aging very rapidly. They're driving the young kids out. It's very important and relevant to politics that a lot of commentators observe that most Australians own their own home, and so they would be financially better off with rising prices. And so people don't expect the electorate to vote for reform of zoning regulations. Now, those observations are true, but those homeowners actually care about their kids. Parents want their children to have similar opportunities to what previous generations had. In particular, they don't want the kids and the grandkids to move away from where they grew up. They'd like to remain in contact. And no one wants, regardless of what property prices are doing, no one wants to drive out to Bathurst to babysit the grandkids. I'll just end with one final observation just about the differences between New Zealand and Australia. And this is, as Stuart said, this is a slightly different quotation from the same housing minister, Chris Bishop. Just another way he put it is that we need housing to be more affordable, and quote, that means house prices falling. And it also means average incomes rising. Unfortunately, Australian politicians are not saying that. They're saying the opposite. Our housing minister, Claire O'Neill, says we don't want house prices to fall. We want house prices to grow sustainably. And changing this strikes me as what's going to be the first step for any change in housing policy in Australia, that we need an acknowledgement that house prices have to stop rising. So they were my thoughts. We might now move to Q&A. First question that's come through, Stuart, is my guess is that Australia's housing debate is 5 to 10 years behind New Zealand's, and other countries are even further behind. Why did New Zealand move so much quicker than other countries? Your thoughts, Stuart?
It's a really good question. My hunch is it's because housing outcomes got so bad. So housing outcomes in New Zealand got so bad that housing became, around 2017, became the number one or one of the top issues facing voters nationally in the central government election that we had. That's unthinkable. If you go back just a decade or two, housing was way, way down the list below, the bigger portfolios like health and education. So the fact that housing outcomes got so bad really prompted New Zealand to move fast and to move far with its reforms in terms of their ambition. What I would like to add here is a footnote, in a way, a historical footnote that we mention in the paper, or we touch on in the paper, is that from 2011 on, the incumbent centre-right government, I think, recognised there was a shift in the public mood on housing, and it started to adopt a lot of reforms. Those reforms were effective. They contributed to growth, but they still got booted out in the 2017 elections by an electorate that was very concerned with housing. So they started to try to tackle the issue, but they moved, if anything, too slowly, and they still got voted out. In a recent interview, the Deputy Prime Minister, Bill English, was asked if he had any regrets from his time in office, and he said, "I wish I had gone harder on housing." It was the issue that he picked out as his biggest regret. And I just want to emphasize that for politicians and political parties in Australia, sure, there is a risk from championing these kinds of reforms, but there's also a risk from not. And if you're an incumbent government and you end up in a situation with a housing affordability crisis, well, I don't rate your chances. So
yeah, I agree. It's a good question. I mean, a difficulty with your answer, Stuart, is that affordability is terrible in Sydney and London and San Francisco and New York, but they're all way behind New Zealand. I think it is something about the quality of your politicians, which I think was shown in that contrast between our housing ministers.
I think there is something in that. I think there's also something in the substitutes that are available for New Zealanders. So, you mentioned Bathurst, Peter, right? The substitute for
Yeah.
New Zealanders is not Bathurst; it's Brisbane, and you can't drive there. And so that awareness of older people who might be comfortable and own their own homes, the sensitivity to the risk that their children can't afford to live in their city, is much more acute because their next best alternative might be places like Brisbane, and that's even further away. So I think that also has something to do with it. Levels of migration from New Zealand are very high, and a lot of it's heading towards Australia, at least historically, because you had cheaper housing and higher wages. So
A question from James Graham, who we know. Can you talk about what happens when upzonings are broad enough to cover areas that are not highly in demand or are not already at capacity? Is there any way to control for this in this kind of research?
yeah, that's a really good question. I think my intuition, I think it's an area where we need more research. My intuition is that you would expect, once you get to that point with your upzoning, you would probably expect smaller effects from upzoning. You're not in such a constrained environment. There is some questions over sort of competition effects and market power. So one of the, in Auckland, we found we had a relatively broad upzoning that had relatively large effects. It's possible that the breadth of the upzoning enabled a lot more supply of developable parcels and effectively created a bit of competitive tension that encouraged people who had owned land on developable sites to move quickly because they could see a scenario where another developer might eat their lunch. So I still think there's probably benefits from upzoning widely, even in a situation where the housing is not super constrained, but you would probably expect smaller effects. If I understand the question, I should mention here to all the other audience listeners that James is very clever, and I might not have totally understood what he was asking.
The point I would add is that zoning constraints vary a lot from city to city, and this is maybe most clearest in the United States, where you have very strict zoning on the coasts in California and New York in particular, whereas the zoning is fairly liberal in much of the Midwest and the South. And the effects will vary a lot. If you allow skyscrapers in Dallas or Houston, it's actually not going to make much difference because they can already build them. Whereas if you were to allow them in San Francisco or New York, they'll be snapped up immediately and supply will jump. Next question from David Alsop. What differences are there between the broad but modest upzoning to enable townhouse development of the sort that you described going on in Auckland and major upzoning in key locations to enable large apartments and mixed-use developments?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was asked that question earlier today when I was interviewing with ABC in Victoria, I think. My response, I would go for both. I think there's very clear strategic and economic reasons, policy reasons why you'd want to go for a big upzoning around rapid transit, for example. We talked about the operating costs of those services. Those sorts of services experience very strong economies of density. They become much more efficient when you have a lot of people using them. So we should go big around those locations and enable, very tall buildings and very tall apartments, lots of apartments. I think the broad upzoning that you saw in Auckland was effective because it created a whole lot of opportunities for supply. But townhouses are very quick to knock up. And so that's beneficial because you want a quick response. But also what I've seen in Auckland is developers that previously sort of specialized in greenfields, detached dwellings, started to get into the townhouse market, as did some developers who previously specialized in apartments. They've started to build townhouses as well. So townhouses are sort of this middle ground between detached dwellings and apartments that is quite an easy market to get into, and that means it becomes quite competitive, and that's good. It also, and that's before you talk about the demand side, where there might be people who maybe would all other things equal, would prefer a detached dwelling. But when you show them the price trade-off of a townhouse, they're willing to take a townhouse because it's just so much better value. And, for people who might normally prefer to be in an apartment, similarly, if you can give them a townhouse at a competitive price, they might take it. So it's quite a good substitute. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, largely I agree. Next question from Aaron Bell. What can central governments do to break the incentive system that leads local governments to fear a NIMBY backlash and then block housing?
It's a really good question. So it'll vary from place to place. In the New Zealand context, one of the major problems they have is voter turnout in local government elections is down around 30 to 40%. And, you can look at the breakdowns of those voters and see that there's a very clear slant towards demographics that would be less supportive of housing. So, it's hard to overcome that. And that's a complex area. I'm not an expert in democracy and democratic processes. But so putting that to one side, where the New Zealand government is going is to offer incentives, financial incentives or payments to local councils. So establish, the details of this are still being worked through. We don't know the full details, but effectively have a fund that is paid out to councils based on how much housing they deliver. I think Australia has versions of this, but my understanding, I think you know more about it, Peter, is that the payouts are too slow. There's too much of a lag between when councils build housing and when they get the money. So it's very important if you're doing these financial incentives of mechanisms that you, once again, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Don't wait 4 years until the housing has been delivered 4 years after to say, oh, here's your money. Make it a much quicker sort of process so that the councils who do deliver more housing get a larger payout to compensate them for some of these sort of non-pecuniary effects of growth, and help them provide services that might, appeal to their residents. There's probably other mechanisms. Do you have ideas, Peter?
Yeah, so the federal government in Australia offers a new home bonus of about $15,000 a dwelling for state governments that meet their housing targets. But it doesn't pay that till after a 5-year period, which is beyond the horizon that decision makers need in terms they'll be facing the voters well before then, and the housing will take too long to deliver. So I think that takes too long to come through. It's also a lot of councils are just uncertain as to whether they would actually get it or whether it'll be their successors that get it. So there's a lot of uncertainty in that also. The other thing I'd mention is the thing that central governments can and should do is to set targets for local councils. This is something that's the New South Wales and Victorian governments are doing. It's popular overseas in many Canadian provinces. The United Kingdom is about to do it. It means that the central government, which cares about the quantity of housing, makes sure that the broader interest is taken care of in terms of supplying more housing, but it allows local councils to decide for themselves about the kind of housing. So if a local council wants to meet its target by one huge skyscraper or by a large number of townhouses, that can be decided locally. So it provides a compromise between some who want local control while also ensuring that the broader public interest is taken account of. Next question. You mentioned that the New Zealand construction industry has doubled between 2013 to 2023. That's a big issue in Australia where a lot of people are worried that we don't have the workers to build these houses. How easy was it to find the workers to double your construction workforce?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So the timing in this case was on New Zealand's side. So they upzoned sort of a decade ago. There was more slack in the labour market. New Zealand also has quite a flexible labour market, I think, compared to Australia. In terms of it's quite easy to hire and fire people. In a way, I think my understanding is, I'm not an expert in this, but and also migration played a large role. There were a lot of skilled tradespeople that were allowed to migrate into New Zealand to sort of ramp up the construction sector workforce. I think one point I will say though is if you think of the economy as a whole, people really value houses, like people like having a nice house. And so if you enable the supply of housing to increase, what we've seen in New Zealand, they will substitute away from other goods to housing if you make that possible, And so there's probably people pulled into the construction sector, pulled out of other sectors, because the returns from working in construction were higher. They could make more money, and that's okay. Allowing people to substitute from what you might think of lower value sectors into construction so that they can, contribute to this increased supply. That may be where you get some of your workforce from. And that's okay.
Yeah, just the thing I want to add about this is that construction is highly cyclical. It's one of the most cyclical industries in the economy, and employment goes up and down a lot. And every boom, we need to find a huge pile of workers to lay the bricks and hammer the nails, but we do find them. Immigration adjusts, wages adjust, training adjusts. It's definitely an issue, but it's not a new one. It's an issue that the industry has been dealing with and addressing, not perfectly, but satisfactorily, for as long as it's been around.
One quick comment on that, Peter, just to elaborate, is productivity can adjust too, right? So there are some signals or hints in the New Zealand data that following upzoning and this big increase in supply, the productivity of the construction sector seems to have increased. So the workforce in New Zealand doubled, but the output of the sector almost tripled. So there are some hints that there's some productivity gains to be had from upzoning, but we need more research on it.
Can you talk about the supply skeptics' claim that housing is not currently legislative constrained, that it's not constrained by zoning, but instead is constrained by finance? A lot of builders say that the reason they're not building is they can't get the finance. Does that mean that zoning is unimportant?
My answer is, of course, finance is important. I mean, you mentioned previously that construction is a cyclical industry. That implies that it's affected by financial conditions and economic conditions. But zoning matters too. And so, if there's a constraint you can do a lot about, which is zoning, why would you not alleviate that constraint? I think the other argument that's sort of bundled in or implicit here is that if you constrain housing in one location, the demand will just shift to another location. I have big problems with that argument because not all locations are equal. Bathurst is not equal to Sydney. Bathurst is perfectly fine, but people who grew up in Sydney probably don't want to move there. So this underlying assumption that you can just shift demand around, and that's the only effect of zoning, and that it's somehow this innocuous effect, I find that a very deeply unsatisfying argument. Peter, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, finance is not exogenous. That zoning operates to increase the price of land, and it keeps increasing it until all the marginal producers fall out, until supply matches demand. So that finance will always be a constraint. You will have prices will be bid up till all but one developer can go ahead with the project. Everyone else will fail to get finance for the project. So you've got huge numbers of builders out there saying they couldn't get financing. Only one of them does get the financing, but that's because the zoning works to limit the supply so that only one of them can get it.
I'm a big fan of talking to anybody, construction sector, firms, whatever. But just be aware that when you upzone and your supply expands, you will get new firms entering the market that you cannot talk to now because they don't exist. So just be careful of putting too much weight on the views of the incumbent developers.
Reform in New Zealand involved the coming together of academics, think tanks, grassroots mobilisation, politicians, journalists. It worked on many, many levels. Which of those were important? And in particular, does New Zealand have some constellation of those that other countries didn't have? I'll just add to that question. I mean, I think in your paper you emphasise the role of the New Zealand Productivity Commission. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the New Zealand Productivity Commission just established, long rest in peace. But in 2011, it produced a housing affordability a report as part of its housing affordability inquiry, and that was around that 2011 period when we saw the big spike in messaging around housing. So they really sought to synthesize the evidence, consider the issues, and in a way prioritize the reforms. And so that was a very valuable contribution. And it's hard to know what's endogenous, and like the media environment is also endogenous. But I have noticed a tendency for some of the younger journalists in New Zealand who have been, I assume, adversely affected by poor housing outcomes, come through and be willing and enthusiastic about reporting on housing issues. It's much more front of mind for them, and so they seem to be particularly driven, which has been great.
Yes, the thing I'd like to add, particularly from my own experience, is that economic research has been really important in driving this whole issue forward, starting, I guess, with the work of Ed Glaser and Joe Gyurka. That was particularly influential in my thinking, at least. And I think this is important because there are probably some young economists out there in the audience who despair that their work will ever change anything or have any influence. And this is just a wonderful example of research changing people's mind. It first convinces the academics, then the think tanks, then the journalists, then the grassroots people going, and then finally the politicians. And that chain is working, and it's at different stages in different countries. We've got time for, I think, one last question for Pete Klistov. Can I ask a question around land value capture? What do you think is the state of this as a policy in Australia at the moment? And is it a technological, methodological issue that's preventing this from becoming a bigger thing?
So land value capture is an interesting area in itself. I assume what we're talking about there is a tax to capture some of the increase in value that comes from upzoning. I guess I would consider it as a taxation question. Is it a good tax? Is it a good way to fund or to fund activities that might lead to upzoning? I don't have strong views on it. I do think there's some evidence that higher land taxes tend to incentivize more rapid development and denser development. But I sort of see those as secondary effects to the taxation question. I'm certainly not opposed to it, but it's sort of a second order thing for me. But Peter, you might have some other views on it.
Yeah, so my sense is that the large majority of economists would support higher land taxes. But people have been campaigning for higher land taxes for, 150 years? Progress and Poverty was written in the 1870s, and we've got nowhere. So it's a nice idea, but I just don't see it as being on the political agenda at the moment. And it does overlap with the zoning issue, but I think it seriously complicates the question. And I think there's a lot of merit to keeping the issues fairly simple. Stuart, we're out of time. Did you want to say any final words?
Oh no! Look, I think it's really encouraging, the movement I've seen in Australia in the 10 years that I've lived there, and I'm not there anymore. So I think this sort of discussion is really important, and I really, fingers crossed, because at some point we might want to return to Australia, that we can get the better housing outcomes. So yeah, thanks to everyone for tuning in. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, a reminder to everyone that Stuart's paper is available for download on the CIS website, and I'm sorry for those who asked questions that we didn't get to, but this will be an ongoing debate, and we'll be talking about these for many years to come. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and bye.
Thank you.
For decades, the CIS has been an independent voice working to promote free markets and limited government. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.